Hello, everybody, and welcome here. Hello. We're just gonna wait a few minutes before we get started. So before we get started today, we want to get to know you guys a little bit better. So how about you write where you're coming from in the chat, where you're located, so we get to know you a little bit better. Amazing. Hi, everyone. Perfect. Hello. Great. Perfect. Sorry, I was trying to get myself organized there. All right, so hello everyone and welcome here today. First of all, thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy schedules to be here today. I'm Stephanie Keels, marketing specialist. We also have Chelsea on the call today, our digital designer, helping out today with the tech side of things. So you might see her in the chat bot answering some questions. So feel free to say hello to her. So before we get started, I just want to start today's session today by acknowledging that Keel's head office is located in Vancouver, which is on the transitional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and gives thanks for the generosity and hospitality on these lands and waters. If you're new to Keel, welcome. Keel is a fundraiser CRM that is designed with the unique needs of fundraisers in mind and aims to unify communications, donor management, and it's a single source of truth. So if you have any questions for Traci today, please enter them in the chat bot or Q&A section below. We'll get to as many as we can by the end. Speaking of the chat bots, please remember to select everyone when you type, and so our guests can see your comments and questions. And finally, the webinar is being recorded, and you will receive access to the recording by the end of the week. Before I hand it off to Traci, I'd like to welcome Catherine, who's going to say a few words about Imagine Canada's Grant Connect.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. I'm Catherine, and I'm the lead of data analytics for Imagine Canada's fundraising platform, Grant Connect. I'm really excited to hear Traci's presentation on impact measurement today, especially as somebody who works with data on the daily. Before we get started, I just want to take a bit of time to introduce Grant Connect to you all. Grant Connect is a cloud database platform that charities and nonprofits use to search for institutional funding opportunities and to easily identify which opportunities align with their own causes. Most of you will know how much time it can take to find quality funding opportunities, and Grant Connect helps with that by offering curated data on well over 11,000 Canadian foundations and hundreds of corporations and government grant programs, and other funding sources, including international funders. We on the data team actively track funding opportunities and update this daily with information like deadlines, financial information, and giving history. My colleague Alex and I will be in the chat throughout the presentation if anyone has questions about Grant Connect. And if you want to talk funding data or anything Grant Connect related, feel free to reach out to me at cwang@imaginecanada.ca. Thanks again, and now I'll hand it back over to Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Now I'm very excited to welcome our expert speaker today, Traci. Traci is the CEO and the president of the Mark USA and has extensive experience in advising high-growth organizations, strategy, finance, and operations. So I'm going to pass it over to Traci.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to talk about this topic and really appreciate your questions and interest in it. Just to start off with our title slide, how do I measure and demonstrate what matters? I think that's really important question that we all ask, and something that is around impact reporting and understanding what it is and how to set it up. Heading to the next slide, a little bit about who we are. I like to say we're a small global company because we don't just do and work with clients here in the US. We also have worked with various clients abroad. So both Cambodia, Africa, different countries, right? So we're considered a small global company headquartered in the US, but we're mission driven and passionate about who we serve as clients. A lot of individuals that we work with are individuals that have really ambitious goals and ambitious missions, and that's something that we share in terms of accomplishing that together and setting up a framework that really supports that. We're uniquely qualified with decades of experience combined with government, community-based nonprofit organization management, and the private sector. So we have about 20 folks here throughout the country that also work on this with me. And I think what's really interesting too is that we're a third-party certified minority and woman-owned small business. So we're a living example of what investment in communities and organizations can achieve and look like by working with different parties. And that's really exciting when it comes to impact reporting. Next slide, please. So to start off, we're often asked, like, how do you define impact? Or what exactly is impact reporting, right? And so here at the Mark, we like to see it as the intersection between like resource contribution and use, combined with what parties want to achieve in terms of positive social change. The reason for that is because a lot of stakeholders want to know whether or not their contributions are connecting with the change, right? And whether or not people are able to see it, experience it, and acknowledge it, and really see whether or not they're achieving the impact they envision, right? That's really important for a lot of mission-driven organizations, is really ensuring that you're actually achieving those results of what you envisioned would be the change in the communities and for those that you serve, right? And so for us, it's defining impact as the intersection of those two things. And the reporting structure is just the mechanism by which you're being able to articulate and demonstrate that through, right? So next slide. For us as individuals that are interested in impact reporting, we like to see that we're accomplishing a bigger vision than ourselves, right? So I was actually going to play Louis Armstrong's song, you know, What a Wonderful World, but I think there's an emotional connection and there's also a passionate connection to really wanting to see communities and people thrive, right? So I used a couple of buzzwords here to really say, like, you want to see leaders of tomorrow, you want to see better community, you want to see wealth creation for people, you want to see better humanity, right? There's a lot of things that we ambitiously want to achieve, even to the point where some individuals can say, hey, you're looking for a utopia. And I say, absolutely. But through impact reporting, you want to be able to bring that into chunk-sized pieces to really see what is your organization achieving and how it's lending to that vision, right? How are we achieving different parts of it over time? So that's a little bit about, like, why is this important for people to achieve and look at impact reporting? We all inherently want to achieve something greater than ourselves. And I think that's inherent in us as human beings, and we also want to see positive change. And impact reporting is a mechanism for being able to see those changes. Next slide, please. So outcomes versus outputs. This is a topic that we like to talk a lot about when it comes to acknowledging how you use information that you have in your impact reporting framework, right? Oftentimes, for a lot of sustainability reports or impact reports or ESG reports, you notice there's a lot of focus on output. And the reason for that is because those are the things that we can easily count, right? The number of dollars contributed, the number of people who have participated, the number of people we serve, right? It's really easy to count those things or acknowledge those items. And that is important as part of the impact and being able to demonstrate such, but also sort outcomes. And outcomes are something that we tend to leave out because it's not something that we easily acknowledge or can measure, right? But outcomes is the piece, is what is the change that has resulted? And at the same time, we like to see things in terms of outcomes, both short-term, long-term, and medium-term, right? So characterizing what time frame or expectation there is around outcomes. The balance of both and being able to report both in your impact reporting structure is really important, because people care more about what change resulted or the actual impact more than who participated or how much money was contributed. And I say that delicately, because when people are looking for, the return on investment of their dollars contributed, or they're looking for the transparency or accountability of what actions took place and how money and resources were used, they need the affirmation and the validation that something changed, and hopefully something changed positively, right? So that they're more apt to put more resources or more effort towards something, right? And so output is nice. They like to know that something's increased or decreased, right, in terms of number of dollars or participation of individuals. But what they're really seeking is the outcome piece, right? And what's really important about the outcome piece too is it demonstrates to individuals the why or how they should contribute more, because they can see the results that are achieved. They can see the difference between what has changed, and that balance between outcomes and outputs is what is significant in an impact reporting framework, right? So just wanted to highlight that. Next slide, please. A couple examples of illustrative projects that we've worked on, just to characterize like the different types of work that we've done around impact reporting, that kind of probably likely relate to aspects of your own work. We did a project for the Society for Advancing Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And the focus for them was really supporting individuals and encouraging students at a young age to pursue STEM careers. And one thing that they're really focused on is providing conferences that not only bring students and practitioners together and professionals to share and learn about STEM professions and inspire the students by attending these conferences, but supporting them in terms of what they need over their lifetime in terms of professional development, right? And so micro level, we've done work around pre and post reporting around where or what have students learned, or how do they feel, or what's the environment and what is their knowledge base before they've gone and attended these conferences, and then post conference, how do they feel, what skills do they acquire, how have things changed, right? So for SACNAS in particular, they're able to see not only what change has occurred and in what areas, and in particular, what is the input from the participants that attend these conferences, but more importantly, they're also able to construct the conferences more strategically because they know what the participants are saying and what is working and what's not working, right? And so they're able to also assess their gaps in terms of their program development and be able to deploy resources and decision-making differently, right? So that's a more micro example, right? Another example that's education-based, but is more in the context of, you know, SACNAS is a community-based organization. The example that I'm going to highlight right now is higher education. So this is for a higher education institution, UCLA, here in Southern California, that's focused on mathematics and teaching. And for this particular project, we were tasked with evaluating like support programs and school districts. So it's really understanding how higher education is working with K through 12 as an example. And it included surveys and focus groups. And what was really impactful about this particular, we're looking at teacher efficacy and the impact of the pandemic on student learning and, again, teacher efficacy in the classroom, right? And, you know, some of the observations observed from this project, like for instance, that it was found that students didn't learn as well virtually, right? And for a lot of us, you know, some of us may acknowledge that without necessarily having to see the data, right? But what was helpful for UCLA in particular and individuals that are leading this program is that it's the validation. It's the, you know, they had a sense of virtual learning was not as effective or as helpful to both students and teachers. But obviously during the pandemic, that's what they had to resort to. But they didn't have that extra information or certainty that they needed by, you know, doing this study and being able to make that observation. And it wasn't just limited to, you know, that observation that virtual learning, you know, wasn't as impactful. The study also highlighted other detrimental effects that, you know, what are the potential consequences of this virtual learning for students, in particular around higher education and K through 12 in this geographic location, moving forward, right? So it helped identify for them what type of decisions they need to make now, today, in a post-pandemic world, but they were able to see some of that information earlier on, I guess you could say, towards the tail end of the pandemic, to be able to strategize and kind of change directions and be in a better position, you know, post-pandemic wise, to make certain decisions because of that, right? Because of that study. And how they could better improve the programs, right? So similar to the first example. I'll just highlight, the last three. Wanted to highlight Reach Out, which is a violence prevention program that we're evaluating and working amongst community members and individuals. And what's really exciting about this and violence prevention is it wasn't limited to any type of violence. It could be trauma, it could be domestic violence. Like there wasn't any one certain type of violence that this was limited to. And it was interesting and really inspiring to see like the individual engagement combined with the community engagement across different organizations and types of organizations, from the private sector to government to community-based organizations collaborating together, and how they're focused on violence prevention and being able to see through the data evaluation framework what the input is, both at a macro level, meaning the whole entire county or across organizations, but also at the micro level. What are the individuals passionate about, and what is it that they're really struggling with, and how do these organizations address that, right? Last two are examples, just overseas projects that we've worked on. Partners for Development is a non-governmental organization that was doing work in Benin, Africa, and agricultural development for pineapple exportation to Europe. And that was a really inspiring project because the expectation was that a lot of the agricultural workers were male, and what really came out through the results of the project is the majority of them were actually females providing for their households. And so that really impacted how they were managing the program, but also how they were obtaining financing, because a lot of females in Benin can't obtain loans and can't obtain financing by nature of being a female in country, right? So it's inspired creative ways and conversations with banks and financing institutions locally to better support the females that are providing for their families. So that's pretty exciting. And then Chabdai in Cambodia is a human trafficking organization that provides support to individuals. And that one's a really interesting project because it was actually a UK-based leadership team with Cambodia management in country. And we were also working stateside here from the US, and really interesting to see the cultural implications, but also the results and the progress that they were making, and being able to see the global contributions. So that was really exciting about that one. Next slide, please. Okay, to talk a little bit about how, right? A lot of individuals ask the question, like, how do you implement an effective impact reporting structure? We like to focus on identifying what are the shared objectives and goals between internal and external stakeholders. And by that, I mean, just as an illustrated example, your external stakeholders are not only the individuals that you serve, they could be your donors, they can be the immediate community based on who you serve and where you're located, right? And then internal stakeholders, which are your management team, your staff, your employees, it's your grant making or your business development and fundraising and community relations functions. It's your accounting and finance. So it's looking at the business or organizational functions within your organization, and it's being able to connect the dialogue and the communication and the shared objectives and goals across both internal and external stakeholders into one single integrated community-focused or stakeholder-centered data evaluation framework. Now, I know that when I say that, I make it sound really simple. It's not, because there are a lot of diverse groups involved and a lot of different objectives, more importantly, like functional objectives. But what we have to understand by all these parties working together is that, as an example, fundraising or anybody who's writing a grant needs to articulate the impact or the results or the work that an organization is accomplishing. And for them, they need the data or information that will help them make that argument, right? And advocate for why an organization should receive X funding, right? For those that are members of managing a program and executing what the organization does from an employee standpoint, they're able to use the same source of information to make decisions about how to improve a program and or identify certain gaps that exist so they can change how they deploy resources. So going back to the examples I used of some of the projects and how they've used data and how they've used kind of an impact reporting structure, it serves this dual purpose for different type functions as an example. So hopefully me characterizing that as an example helps you to connect the dots between how functions relate to each other, but also how they can share information and also be able to construct an impact reporting structure that not only is something that the internal stakeholders can use to deploy resources or change decisions that they're making, but also it's a communication tool that they're able to communicate externally to those who they're raising funds through or interacting with community members around what they're doing, right, in the community. So you're using one single reporting structure to be able to do that and also involve the dialogue and exchange of those objectives and goals across different parties when you're implementing this framework. I think what's really interesting when you try to implement this framework, it not only do you identify that you have more in common than sometimes you thought, but also as you're dialoguing and hearing what different individuals struggle with, both internally and externally, you're able to also identify, differences too. And it's something that, we found, and I think a lot of our clients have found by implementing this framework, is there's certain things they didn't know that were certain struggles or challenges caused by one function to another within an organization, and it was not intentional, right? Like by not having data for the grant maker or for the individual who's fundraising, oftentimes fundraisers are like, that information was really helpful because it helped me to raise more funds, or it helped me to better articulate what we're achieving as an organization. So that's an example where it was a non-intentional pain point, but obviously by implementing the data evaluation framework, that individual is able to do their job better and more effectively and really appreciate the data. Same thing for those that are managing the program and making decisions about where to deploy resources or what to do and how to better serve individuals. They've referred to the same data to kind of validate what they already knew or didn't know, right? So in any case, next slide, please. And give me 1 second. Oops. Okay. So here's kind of the data evaluation framework mapped out in 5 simple steps, right? And I say simple steps because we're taking a very complex reporting structure that involves a lot of moving parts and a lot of different people groups and a lot of different functions, and breaking it down into a simplified framework, right? So one of the things that we often advocate for and start with is a logic model or theory of change. And you can find examples, through Google, World Wide Web, on different theories of change and logic model examples from different organizations. So it's public knowledge, it's a public resource, right? But it's really starting with a logic model and theory of change, where you're bringing both those internal and external stakeholders that I referred to all together in basically workshop meetings, where you're able to map out in the context of a logic model both the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And later in the slide deck, I'll actually provide you with a template for how you would do this. But it's having these dialogues and it's creating these workshops to bring multiple functions together from an internal standpoint, and bringing and incorporating the input from external stakeholders all together in one cohesive document and in one cohesive tool, where, if you're trying to onboard a new CEO of an organization, or you're trying to onboard a new volunteer, or you're trying to onboard a new board member, as an example, what's really helpful is organizations have been able to whip out this logic model or theory of change, which is literally on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper in a visual, easy to understand format that helps those new stakeholders understand how they can be a part of the process, how they can contribute, what is it that the organization is trying to achieve, And it also incorporates and reconciles any differences in functions or objectives, and again, focuses on the shared objectives and commonalities. So that's kind of step one, right? And we consider that the foundational piece, because once you've isolated and constructed this logic model and theory of change, you now know what you're going to measure, because you've clearly outlined and articulated what are your short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes and your output. Now, the output for a lot of organizations, you already have that data at your disposal. It tends to be, again, like dollars, number of people, right? But the outcomes piece, again, like I mentioned earlier, tends to be the challenging part, because how do you measure wealth creation? How do you measure whether or not the jobs that we're creating contribute to generational wealth? You know, so when it comes to a lot of these more lofty, like less tangible goals and objectives in the form of outcome, we struggle with the data measurement, right? But what's great is by mapping this out in the logic model and theory of change, you now know, like, okay, what tools do I need to develop? What kind of questions and protocols do I need to create so that I can obtain that information that's necessary to measure and exemplify the outcome or the changes that are occurring over time, right? So anyway, the second step of the process is moving into fact gathering. So, you know, oftentimes we get the question around, hey, I already have a lot of data. We've invested a lot of resources in information gathering. And, you know, I have a lot of information at my disposal. I don't want to waste that. I don't want to start from scratch, right? So part of step two is really identifying, as you're sorting through what information already exists in an organization and how you're using it, you're trying to find alignment with your logic model and theory of change to decide whether or not that information is still relevant, or whether or not that some of that information can kind of go to the wayside, right? And more importantly, as part of this process, you're understanding where your gaps are in information. So again, when you move to tool development, by understanding what your gaps are in the outcome measurement, you're able to understand, okay, what kind of questions and what kind of mode by which do I ask this of individuals? How do I address that, right? So anyway, that's fact gathering. It's also a point to put together what I refer to as an evaluation strategy. So before you go through any of the rest of the steps, you want to really think strategically around who's doing it, why are we doing it, what are we doing, right? All the questions around who, what, where, why, and how. And you want to lay that out in your evaluation strategy, which is also going to lay out more detailed framework behind this integrated data framework for impact reporting, right? So that's number two. Number three, tool development is around not only how you're going to ask and gather information, but what you're going to ask, right? And this also ties back to number one, because the outcomes that you've identified in phase one is what you're going to measure for, and how you're going to create the tools to obtain that information in step three, right? And when I say the mode, I'm usually referring to, you know, people like to point to surveys, but surveys aren't always optimal, because you can't have conversations or dialogue or understand context for people's responses. So you may be looking to interview people one-on-one, where people are comfortable providing input to you one-on-one. You need a list of questions and an interview protocol, right? How are you going to approach the interview so you obtain the information that you need, while at the same time one-on-one works really well for individuals because they may be more comfortable sharing than, let's say, in a focus group setting, right? But then in a focus group setting, you know, group dynamics and engagement also sometimes creates more access to input, because people feel more comfortable sharing, especially when someone else feels the same way, right? So the way in which you gather information and the different ways that you do that are really important to consider, but that's also part of the tool development. What do we develop to support the mode by which you collect that information? The last two focus on data collection and data analysis and reporting. And again, you're going to focus back on your evaluation plan from step number two, because who's going to collect the data and who are we asking, right? And really identifying those parties is really important, right? As well as the context for how you analyze data and information is also important, because you don't want to leave anything out, right? And you also don't want majority opinion or majority input to be the only thing that's covered in impact reporting. You want to ensure that what's being presented is a balanced approach across all input that's received. But because you're looking at statistical data and you're analyzing it from a very research methodological approach, you also know what's statistically significant, right? But you're not excluding, minority viewpoints either, right? And then reporting, people often think is fairly easy. It also gets complex, because not only is it important to consider, whether or not you report using a Microsoft PowerPoint or a Microsoft Word and the length and how you articulate those report findings, but it's also consideration for what technology tools you use to report. As an example, we've often used Google Studio or Tableau. We also like to look at data visualization tools, because human beings, whether or not you're for data or not, we can easily interpret and understand pictures, right? So data visualization becomes really significant from that standpoint, because whether or not you understand statistics or not, doesn't matter. It helps all people to understand what the change is and how it occurs. So that's something to consider around the complexities of reporting. Next slide, please. I think I covered a little of this in terms of common challenges, but I think it's worth also mentioning, more directly, like, what are the limitations of impact reporting, and ensuring that parties really understand that, right? You're not going blindly into implementing this framework and looking at data and information without understanding certain limitations. So we like to say that, it's hard to isolate any one single cause and effect when you're looking at a result, because there are multiple variables that are involved in the result of something, or the change of something, and the outcome of something. It's multidimensional, and the interaction of those variables is what can often result in that change of outcome. So here's an example. Somebody may want to evaluate whether or not job creation is creating a livable wage, right? And one complexity is, how do you define livable wage, right? And that's part of the logic model and theory of change exercise when you're bringing multiple stakeholders together, is if that is an outcome that you want to measure, you are all consistently defining in the context of your organization and the people that you serve, what is the definition of livable wage that we're trying to achieve here, right? But more importantly, going back to my example about how isolating cause and effect is really difficult, is livable wage is actually impacted by other things that go beyond what you're doing as an organization or contribution, right? There's government benefits, there's accumulated wealth, generational wealth that one has to account for. And so there are other things, right, or other variables or other factors that go into outcome measurement, right? But at best, by having this impact reporting structure, you're able to better understand what those variables could be, and also what your role is in influencing and improving one of those variables. So at best, again, when it goes back to all of us wanting to make and improve community and people's lives, you at least are able to see whether or not there's an improvement or not based on your contribution, even if you can't isolate the exact variable, right? Another challenge that we often see is obtaining buy-in and representative multi-stakeholder engagement. When I spoke about the logic model and wanting to ensure that you have representation across different internal functions for internal stakeholders, but same thing with external stakeholders. You want to get input from different people groups and from multiple community members so that you get representative information. It's hard to coordinate all these individuals together, right? And ensuring that the input you get represents all parties, right? Another aspect of that is some people are going to be super excited about impact reporting and other people are not. some people are going to be super excited about looking at data and other people are not. And so getting their buy-in to take part and devote time to this process is really challenging. And part of the process of exploring whether or not this is something you implement or not is seeking part of those conversations that lend to obtaining buy-in, understanding what people's challenges or issues are so you can overcome that as part of convincing them or influencing their participation for implementing this structure, right? I talked about these earlier, but output focus instead of outcomes focus tends to be a challenge of impact reporting. Most of the reports that you see publicly are focused on the output piece and not the outcomes piece, right? So it's really overcoming that by understanding the difference between the output and an outcome and how can you measure and achieve the outcome piece. Big one for a lot of us is impact, and being able to see outcomes change requires time. In other words, you need to be able to visibly see a change in something, and that requires time. Oftentimes we want that data yesterday. We need this information now, right? But it takes time to see those changes occur, right? And that's also, I think, to be honest, one reason why a lot of impact reporting focuses on output. It's easier for us to count, right? Dollars. It's easier for us to count the number of participants of something, and there's no time boundary around that, right? So that is another, reality of why is it that most impact reporting focuses on output. And then the last one is we're constrained by resources to observe everything. You'll find as you go through this exercise and talk to people about implementing this, we're curious to ask a lot of questions, and that curiosity leads to us putting those questions in our framework. And that also leads to redundancies, but also the administrative burden of data collection, because sometimes we get curious about something and we end up inputting that into our framework. And so one reason why we mapped out this framework to start with the logic model and theory of change first is that is your North Star to really determine whether or not, when you get curious about asking a question, or the CEO of an organization as an example is like, hey, I want to know this, you can go back to your logic model and theory of change and be like, is that really part of outcome measurement? Is that really something that we decided as an organization we were going to be curious about and to include in our impact reporting structure? Or is that a nice to know piece of information or data, right? So the constraints of time, cost, and money are things that need to be considered when implementing a structure, and that's one reason why that foundational piece is really important strategy-wise. Moving to the next slide, sorry. Ensuring equity. So this is a conversation that a lot of parties are having, and especially when implementing an impact reporting structure. How do you ensure that you've incorporated the input across different people groups, and also is representative of all individuals, right? And so one of the things that we think is worth mentioning is really incorporating the context and the interpretation of the findings, and ensuring that when you're reporting and communicating those findings, you're also explaining the context for what you were measuring, how data was gathered, what are some of the limitations of parties or people that weren't present, because going back to one of the challenges, coordinating and ensuring that everyone is present when doing this exercise is a real challenge. And by nature of them not being present, you may or may not be getting their input. And this is why you also go back to the mode by which you collect information, because some people are more apt to fill out surveys. They could be quick and fast, but maybe somebody didn't get the survey, or maybe they don't like surveys. They'd rather have somebody interview them and ask the direct input. And so the various modes by which you collect data also influence what kind of information gets collected and gets reported, right? And it's being able to answer for and address all of that simultaneously. So really understand the context for and the interpretation of findings and the process by which information was gathered is important to acknowledge. An example that, our team was talking about recently was a study where, it was examined that men and women in observation women had more questions than men. And one of the things that individuals wanted to conclude was that women are dumb because they ask more questions. And we know that that's not true. Women are not dumb, but you have to look at the context, which is what you found out through looking at the study, is that women actually tend to pose their thoughts or their assertions in the form of questions. And the reason for that is because of social dynamics, as well as history and interactions with their male counterparts. And so again, when we talk about context and interpretation, that would be a more simplified example of why context is important. Is we wouldn't want to make the assertion that women are dumb when we know that's not true. So you understanding the interpretation of the findings and the context of the situation and kind of the history and everything outside of that is really important. Broad definition of diversity and representative stakeholder input engagement is super important. Individuals tend to focus on the things that we can observe, right? Race, gender, religion. We like to ensure that diversity includes like difference in perspectives, right? Generational perspectives too, right? Different ages and experiences form what we think and the opinions that we form and the input that we provide. Representative sample data is a really important thing. Language, access, and culture, right? All three are really important in terms of ensuring that the framework you're implementing includes all of that, right? Different country geographies have different cultures and different languages, right? And even when you translate something from English to another language or from another language to English, the cultural implications in the word itself can mean different things, right? And it's making sure that when you're translating something, that context again is there, right? Technology tools and how do you support such a large framework? Oftentimes we resort to Excel and doing analysis in Excel, but flat files are not necessarily useful when it comes to complex analyses, right? So technology tools doing analysis in Tableau as an example, or other technology platforms really helps to build capacity and really helps in terms of systematizing this evaluation framework and impact reporting, as well as the data management of it can be a lot easier. Right, and I'm happy to share what some of those technology tools are. Last but not least, going back to reporting, equitable storytelling and data visualization and results is really important in terms of presentation and how you combine information. Right, being able to disclose that as part of your communication in terms of how you went about analyzing information and the conclusions or results that appeared is really important to consider and really articulate and be transparent about that process. An example in reporting that we talk about internally is, individuals like to use data visualization, and as an example, use red and green. And when you look at a traffic signal, you're like red, green, and then yellow is in the middle. But if you're colorblind, red and green turns into brown. And so if you're accustomed to showing red, meaning a hazard or something bad or something that, you want to alert people to when it comes to data visualization, you want to be aware of that, right? Another is the other bucket, right? We tend to characterize data, report it, and there's an other bucket. And this accounts for, usually like minority input, or, it also accounts for, people tend to use it for race or gender, right? And what people don't acknowledge is you're taking away from agency of identity when you report other, right? So it's acknowledging that, and it's considering that maybe when you report, you want to show the input of everybody and not use the other categorization, right? Another, aspect or another example is when you compare groups, we tend to reference white male as the dominant group, right? And so how could you represent the data so it's not necessarily only white male, but it could be all different nationalities, races, and genders, right? And so again, how you report and how you represent that data visually or in writing is important in terms of equity and stuff. I have a couple more slides towards the latter part of this agreement, latter part of this presentation, but I'm going to leave it with you because I know we're short in time and I really want to leave, opportunity to ask questions. I've attached to the presentation kind of that first step of a workshop on a logic model, right? And I think individuals like to know like what kind of metrics or what kind of things can we refer to. And there's a lot of conversation around, United Nations sustainability metrics or, the World Health Organization metrics, organizations that have metrics that they refer to. And it's really looking at samples of different types of metrics, but looking more importantly at what you as a organization or team or individual want to accomplish and laying it out. So the last 3 slides, and I'll share this presentation and you guys will get a copy of this, really outlines what are the features of this logic model that Traci's been referring to here, right? And how do I think about these pieces? So going to the logic model, the first slide is what are the parts and pieces of a logic model? The next slide breaks down examples of things that you would want to focus on and list in your template. And then going back to the last slide, which is a logic model fill-in, it's being able to map this out in template format. And, as part of our work with clients will sometimes map this all out themselves and come back to us and say, hey, can you review this? Can you give us input? Can you help us wordsmith or facilitate conversations around wordsmithing this between internal and external stakeholders? And other times, they'll hire us to walk through this whole piece. But I wanted to leave you with these last 3 slides so you guys go ahead and do that first step if you so choose to do so in terms of implementing this framework. And with that, I appreciate you guys listening to me for the last 47 minutes.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Traci. So we have a few questions here. Let me just pull them up. Just 1 second. I apologize. So we have one here. How do you measure when it comes to operations? Donors don't always understand the need to fund operations for any work.
Yeah, so operations it goes back to that first step, which is part of the reason why donors don't want to fund operations. They don't understand the nuts and bolts that go into executing a program or go into providing a specific service, right? And so the reason why we like to highlight the results of what you've achieved as an organization through this impact reporting structure is because it helps communicate to those donors what operations is doing and what it's achieved, but it's focusing them on the results you've achieved, right? And the gaps that exist, so that when you approach them for money, it's very clear what you've done with former money, right? Because you can highlight what you've achieved in terms of changes in the community or changes for the individuals you serve, but simultaneously explain why you need more money because of certain gaps that exist in the results that you're trying to achieve over time, right? That may not have been achieved in the first year as an example.
Amazing. So another question here, could you speak a bit more about the evaluation strategy contains, as it seems important to the success of an evaluation framework?
Yeah, so the evaluation strategy is the who, what, where, why, and how of how you're going to go about implementing this evaluation framework, but at the same time, like who's going to be ultimately responsible for ensuring that it's done? What's the work plan look like around this, right? Why are we doing it, right? And it's your clear path forward. It's your plan for being able to communicate to parties who's responsible for what, how are we going to go about doing it, why are we going to go about doing this, and it's your work plan. That's what your evaluation strategy is, which builds confidence for individuals internally to be like, okay, now I'm clear on who's responsible. Am I responsible or somebody else? Why are we doing this? Okay, I can get buy-in and get on board for the cost and the resources that are attributable to this. And you know, who or what are we going to ask? So it lays out all of that in terms of the details of a work plan in the form of an evaluation strategy. And it's the second piece of that 5-step process, so that before you start creating surveys and asking questions and go about the data collection and data analysis and reporting pieces, you're thinking things through in advance and you're planning for it. That's really critical so you don't waste resources, right, of implementing this.
Amazing. So another question here, as the cost of living and inflation are at all-time high, how do organizations now define realistic sustainable growth?
I'd say the way in which that organizations do it, whether or not you're a nonprofit or a for-profit, is we're always seeking growth no matter whether or not there's inflation or not, right? Obviously, right now, the time period that we're in is in some ways unprecedented, not unprecedented compared to, let's say, the 80s when inflation at times was even higher. But I would always just put whatever your goals and objectives are, regardless of the circumstances, right? Because we can't control those external factors. And people are going to give. So like, for instance, when you're having conversation with donors, some donors may not give, right? Because of higher inflation and cost prices and things like that. But others, regardless of inflation or not, they're going to hit, right? So it's staying centered around making sure that your sustainable metrics and your goals and objectives and the outcomes that you want to achieve are mapped out in that logic model, regardless of the time period. Like, we don't know what's going to happen next year or 5 years from now or 10 years from now. It doesn't matter. It's what do you want to achieve and how do you want to affect change for the people that you serve and the communities that we serve. You're going to put that down no matter, even if somebody comes back and criticizes it because they're like, it's too lofty or it's too utopian. I think all of us, like I said, we're here to improve what goes on in our communities and humanity. Some of the things sound impossible, but we want to achieve it, right? We want to do it.
Amazing. And we have another question here. Can qualitative impact statements be made to be as persuasive as quantitative impact statements when impact is less easily measurable?
Yes. So when we implemented a data evaluation framework or impact reporting structure, we use both quantitative information and qualitative information. It's referred to as a mixed methods approach for researchers in terms of like the terminology. And it includes both the open-ended qualitative feedback and information combined with quantitative information, which is usually responses in the form of, you know, scale, or responses in the form of yes or no, or, you know, so the construct for which these tools are developed and the construct by which you ask the information is very strategic and really thoroughly thought through, where it balances both qualitative information and quantitative information. And the importance of both is because oftentimes if someone says yes or no, or rates something on a scale as an example, you don't know why they're rating it like that, right? And you don't know why they're saying yes or no, which is an absolute, you know, answer, right? Whereas when you have open-ended responses or input, it's like when you interview somebody or you have a focus group, you don't need to just stick to the questions asked. You're able to ask, you know, other questions by nature of the dialogue that occurs, right? Now you have a better understanding of context. You also have a better understanding for exceptions to a response, right? You also understand how culture, language, and access influences that response, right? So you get a more full response when you do qualitative and quantitative together, and it's combined in that framework.
Great. And another one here. How can we measure impact when our impact is sometimes more abstract, like creativity or confidence? Let's say we have an aim to increase kids' confidence as writers and increase their enjoyment of writing. How can we measure this?
So it goes back to the outcome piece, which is the change, right? And you're talking about the intangible piece, which is like confidence. How do we measure confidence or that actual change? Because we can't see it or count it as easily like we can with output, right? It goes back to the example I used about the SACNES project, where they were looking at conferences, right? And learnings, right? And education and perception and feelings. Like, they want to capture that pre and post. for the conferences that they work on. So similar enough, you're looking to collect information before or before something is done, right? So you know what your baseline is, you know what the feelings are, you know what the skill level is, you know what the perception is, or you know what the knowledge level is before, right? Then you do the activity or you implement whatever it is you're trying to implement, and then you want to do the same, you want to do a post, right? And now you're able to see by comparing the input and the information that's shared and analyzing it, what that change is, right? So that's how you measure outcomes in a nutshell. It's constructing the pre and post process of gathering information, ensuring it's consistent. So you're looking at apples to apples, not apple to orange pre and post, right? And it's applying that methodology so you can measure confidence, change in skills, things that we can't tangibly touch, right? But are things that we want to acknowledge as really important changes that are occurring.
Amazing. We've got a question here. So what's the difference between outcome evaluation and impact evaluation, and how do they interact?
It goes back to what I said before around oftentimes we focus purely on the output measurement or the output, piece of it. And you want to look at outcomes, right, too, meaning in addition to. So that way you're able to balance, right, the impact, like going back to my definition where it's the intersection, right? You don't want to just look at the things that you can easily count and the things that naturally appear that become really easy for us to measure. You want to look at the outcomes or the change to complement the output measurement. I don't know if I answered that question correctly, but I think, it's the balance of outcomes with output. It's not just output that you want to focus on when you're constructing this reporting structure.
Yeah, amazing. So I think we have time for a couple more questions here. So we have one here. Evaluation can touch on all aspects of nonprofit activities. How would you recommend defining a realistic scope of data evaluation framework?
So one of the challenges I mentioned earlier is like resource constraints, right? In time, money, right? And it also depends on evolution of where you are as an organization. Regardless of whether or not you're a new nonprofit, we've worked with new nonprofits that were just emerging, right? And we've worked with nonprofits that have been around for 200 years, right? So age or evolution or size of nonprofit is not limited by this framework. It's starting with that logic model and theory of change, right? Really mapping out both across your internal and external stakeholders what it is that you're trying to achieve and what do you guys all agree should be achieved as a whole people group, right? A holistic people group. That is your North Star because it now guides what information you collect, how you collect it, and whether or not it goes back to outcome measurement or output measurement, right? Going back to the example where somebody gets curious about something, they're like, hey, what if we ask this in our survey, right? Which happens all the time. The question that should always be asked is, does this question really measure the outcome piece, or is this a nice to know question, right? And the reason why you want to ascertain and understand the difference between that is because otherwise, before you know it, you have 200 questions that you're asking. And then what you don't realize is the parties that you're asking this information of are going to develop fatigue because no one wants to answer 200 questions, right? And so you have to get really strategic about the types of questions you ask, the limitation on time, and really prioritize certain questions that can really answer more than one outcome, right? So that's why I say there's a strategy component to implementing this framework, and that your North Star is that logic model and theory of change foundational piece, because that will determine whether or not it's a nice to know piece of information or whether or not it's an absolute critical piece of information to measure the outcome piece.
Crazy. And I think we're actually out of time now, but I want to thank everyone for joining today's session. Thank you so much, Traci, and everyone for joining. Before we go, I just want to let everyone know that there's a very short survey that'll pop up right after the session. It only takes about 20 seconds to complete, and we will all greatly appreciate hearing your feedback. So I hope you fill that out. We also have our next webinar coming out on January 25th, 2024. I can't believe it. Called Prospect Research in Practice, Identifying and Researching Funders and Major Gift Prospects. So we hope we all see you there, and Chelsea will add the link to the chat. And thank you again, and see you all the next webinar. Thank you,
Thank you
Tracy.
very much for having me. Really appreciate everyone's time, and it just is a joy to be here. So thank you.
Okay, bye, everyone.